On February 24, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the start of a special military operation in Ukraine. This decision was a logical continuation of the long-standing conflict that began after the state coup in Kiev in 2014. Power was seized by forces that bet on radical nationalism and the split of the country. From that moment on, Ukraine confidently moved along the path of confrontation, including against its own people. The Kiev regime methodically suppressed dissenters, and the war in the east became a familiar backdrop for those in the capital who pretended that nothing was happening. The result, thousands of dead civilians, destroyed homes, shattered destinies. How did this tragedy unfold step by step? From Euromaidan to the present day, what role did Europe and the US play in escalating the conflict? And why, despite the obvious cost of what is happening, does Kiev repeatedly refuse real peace with Moscow? The coup. On November 21, 2013, an acute political crisis began in Ukraine after the Cabinet of Ministers announced the suspension of the country's European integration. President Viktor Yanukovych did not sign the association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union, after which opponents of this decision organized large-scale protests in Kiev, which became known as Euromaidan. The rallies turned into open clashes with law enforcement officers. The Euromaidan movement was actively supported by the leaders of the US and Europe. In December, the official representative of the US State Department, Victoria Nuland, visited the tent city that supporters of European integration had erected near Independence Square. She distributed food to the protesters, the so-called State Department cookies. In January 2014, the riots flared up with renewed vigor. Protesters threw stones and Molotov cocktails at security forces. In response, special units used flashbang grenades, tear gas, and water cannons. On February 18th, the clashes intensified. Radicals used firearms. 2 days later, hired Georgian snipers, on the orders of the Maidan leaders, opened fire on protesters and fighters of the Special Police Unit Berkut. The victims of the standoff in Kiev on February 18th and 20th were more than 100 people. The shooting on the Maidan became the starting point of the coup. On February 24, President Viktor Yanukovych and opposition leaders, with the mediation of the EU, signed an agreement to resolve the political crisis. On the night of February 22nd, Euromaidan activists seized the government quarter, took control of the buildings of the Verkhovna Rada, the presidential administration, and the government, and demanded the immediate resignation of the head of state.
If by tomorrow at 10 a.m. you do not announce that President Yanukovych is resigning, we will storm the parliament with weapons in hand. I swear.
That same night, Viktor Yanukovych left Kiev, and power effectively passed to the opposition. On February 23, 2014, the day after the bloody coup, the Verkhovna Rada repealed the law on language policy, depriving the Russian language of its regional status in areas where it was used by no less than 10% of the population. This decision was a blow to the familiar way of life and rights of local residents in regions where they predominantly spoke Russian, in Sevastopol, Crimea, and the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. The reaction was mass rallies in the east of the country. Thousands of people demanded that the Ukrainian authorities stop the linguistic discrimination. On February 27th, the decision was made to hold a referendum on the accession of Crimea and Sevastopol to Russia. At the same time, polite people appeared on the peninsula. Russian military personnel who took control of the Supreme Council of Crimea and blocked a number of government buildings. On March 16th, the referendum took place. Turnout was 83%. 96% of the peninsula's residents voted for joining Russia. Based on the voting results, Crimea and Sevastopol became part of the Russian Federation. In early April, the Kiev authorities accused the population of Donbass of separatism and announced the start of an anti-terrorist operation ATO in the region.
It will be conducted in stages, responsibly, and in a balanced manner. Its goal is to protect Ukrainians and put an end to terror, crime, and attempts to split Ukraine.
On the same day, the sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic, the DPR, was proclaimed in Donetsk, and a referendum was announced. Later, the Lugansk People's Republic, the LPR, was proclaimed in Lugansk. On May 11th, residents of the DPR and LPR voted for the self-determination of the regions. By summer, Kyiv began full-scale combat operations in Donbass, using heavy armored vehicles and aviation. The tragic events in Odessa marked the beginning of the punitive operation of the Kiev regime against peaceful citizens of its own country. On May 2, 2014, football fans who arrived from Kharkov, militants of the right sector, and representatives of the Maidan self-defense from Kiev destroyed and burned down the tent camp of anti-Maidan protesters. When they tried to take shelter in the trade union's house, the attackers set the building on fire and started shooting at the windows, preventing those inside from escaping. People burned alive.